The old woman's fingers left streaks in the desert dust as the truck dragged her across the hard-packed ground, her Sunday dress shredding against gravel and mesquite thorns. The rope cinched around her ankles was tied to the hitch like she was a busted calf, not a 72-year-old widow whose name this land had known for 50 years. Every few feet the truck bounced, and every bounce slammed her ribs, ripped her breath away, smeared more of her blood into the dirt road that led to the dry creek and the canyon beyond. "Sign the deed, May!" one of the men shouted from the truck bed, boots planted, rifle slung loose in his hands like he was bored. "Clayton's being generous today. Tomorrow he ain't." On the ridge above them, a dust devil twisted, then broke around a dark silhouette. A man lay prone behind a dented scope, breath slow, eyes ice cold. At his side, like a carved statue of muscle and nerve, crouched a massive canine, black and brindle, ears pricked, chest barely moving. No panting, no whining, just focus. Titan watched the truck with the same steady stare he had once turned on insurgent compounds halfway around the world. "Range," the man whispered. Titan's tail gave a single, almost imperceptible twitch, his body angling forward, muscles coiling. Below, the driver gunned the engine, the truck fishtailing, May's body jerking violently as she choked on dust. At the gate to the canyon, 2 more trucks waited, men in ball caps and tactical vests, leaning on rails, rifles ready. And in the shade of a rusted corrugated shed, a tall figure in a white Stetson watched the spectacle like it was a rodeo he already knew he'd won. Clayton Rourke, cattle king of Dry Creek County, and the man who'd just signed his own death warrant. A second figure stepped from behind Rourke. Sheriff Hank Dwyer, badge glinting in the sun, hand resting casual on his holstered sidearm, as if the law itself had come to bless the beating. On the ridge, the prone man, Luke Harper, former Navy SEAL, estranged son of the woman now being scraped across the ground, exhaled once. "Titan," he murmured. "On my mark." The truck began to pick up speed. May's hat tore free and tumbled, rolling to a stop against a stone. Her gray hair fanned in the dirt like a broken halo. Luke's hand lifted. The world narrowed to a single heartbeat. "Mark!" Titan launched, a silent, black thunderbolt streaking down the ridge toward the men who thought no one would ever stand between them and this land again. But to understand how this town reached the brink of hell, we have to go back. By the time the highways forgot about it and new maps stopped bothering to mark it, Dry Creek had already learned how to live alone. It was a hard little town folded into a basin of red rock and sparse mesquite. Its main street, a weathered strip of false fronts and swinging signs whose paint the sun had chewed down to pale ghosts of color. Cattle trailers rattled through on their way to somewhere bigger, leaving behind swirls of dust that settled over faded pickup trucks and a diner that never closed because loneliness, like hunger, didn't keep bankers' hours. On the northern edge of town, beyond a rise of scrubland and a barbed wire fence that had been stretched and restretched for decades, sat the Harper Ranch. It was not the biggest spread in Dry Creek County, not by a long shot, but it was old, stubborn land. The creaky windmill near the main house had turned through droughts and flash floods, pumping from a stubborn well that never quite ran dry. That well, quiet and unremarkable, was the whisper of power under everything. Long before papers and lawyers and shell companies, men who knew water in the desert meant life had eyed that well like a loaded gun. May Harper had been a girl when she first rode the fence line here, her hands blistered, her braids tucked under a hat too big for her. She married John Harper at 19, buried him on the hill above the ranch house at 67, and now, at 72, she still rose before dawn. Her knees ached in the winter, and her hands shook a little when she poured coffee. But she still checked the gates, still counted the cattle, still touched the flaking blue paint on the front door every morning like it was a promise. She had given birth to one son in that house. Luke had once run barefoot through these fields, a dark-haired flash racing his own shadow, his laughter echoing off the corrals. Then came the fights, about the town, about the war, about the way John clung to the old ways, while Luke stared at maps of the world taped over his bed. When Luke left for the Navy at 18, without looking back, the silence he left behind settled into the boards of the house like a draft. News of John's heart attack had reached Luke on deployment. He'd called, voice wrapped in a bad connection and unspoken years. And May had listened to the static and the apologies, hearing in both the same thing: distance. They'd spoken every Christmas since, short conversations filled with safe topics: the weather, the number of calves, the state of Luke's knees. She never told him exactly how alone she felt walking the fence line now. He never told her about the sandstorms on the other side of the world, or the dog whose steady presence kept him anchored when the night went long and the explosions shook their bones. When the letter came from Rourke Ranching LLC, it arrived folded clean in a manila envelope with a logo embossed in gold. The mailman, who had once shared beers with John after long cattle auctions, handed it over with his eyes down and his jaw tight. May felt the wrongness before she even slid it open at the kitchen table. The paper was thick, heavy. The language was smooth as oil. They called it an offer of relief and partnership. They spoke of overdue taxes, news to her, and of an opportunity to transition out of high-liability agricultural operations. They cited figures with tidy decimals. They called her land an underutilized resource. At the bottom, in looping, practiced ink, was the signature, Clayton Rourke. Everybody in Dry Creek knew the name. Rourke's family had started with a few cows and a lot of mean ambition. Over the years, their brand burned itself onto more and more cattle hides and fence posts until a man couldn't spit in the county without hitting something owned by Rourke. His trucks sat outside the bank, outside the courthouse, outside the sheriff's office. People joked that the only reason the town sign didn't say, "Welcome to Rourke," formerly known as Dry Creek, was because Clayton didn't have time to change it yet. May read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred, her heart beating a slow, steady drum. She set the paper down, took a breath, and walked out to the hill where John's marker stood. "Clayton Rourke wants the place," she said aloud, her voice rasping in the wind. "Says we owe more than we've got." The breeze stirred the dry grass around the simple stone. It carried with it the smell of sage and old rain, and the faint creak of the windmill turning. May squinted toward the horizon where the land rolled away, where the sky met the earth in a hard, honest line. "They think I'm tired enough to give up," she murmured. "They think I'm scared." She thought of Luke, of his careful, guarded tone on the phone. Then she thought of the way John had spat in the dust the one time Clayton drove up to the property line in his gleaming white truck and offered to help them out during a bad year. May straightened, old spine protesting but not bending. "Well," she said softly, "they're wrong." She went back to the kitchen, put the letter on the table, and wrote "no" across it in firm, shaky pen. The next morning, she drove it into town herself, walked into the office of Rourke's local lawyer, and laid it on his polished desk without a word. The man's smile faltered. The air in the room cooled. Somewhere outside, on Main Street, a cruiser belonging to Sheriff Hank Dwyer rolled slowly past, its windows black, its engine rumbling like a warning. Dry Creek had seen men refuse Clayton Rourke before. None of them had been a 72-year-old widow who lived an hour from the nearest neighbor. By the time May drove back through her gate, the vultures already knew her name. The first sign was small enough that May might have missed it if she hadn't spent a lifetime reading land the way other people read newspapers. A fence post on the south line leaned just a little too far. The barbed wire stapled to it had a clean, bright cut, not the sag of time and weather. On the ground, hoof prints churned the dirt into a shallow trough, far more than her modest herd could make. She followed the tracks, hat pulled low, shotgun resting easy in the crook of her arm, more for the comfort of habit than from any real intention to use it. The prints led to the far corner where her property met a neighboring spread that now belonged to Rourke. There, welded onto the far side of her fence, shone a new metal sign, crisp and white, letters stenciled in bold red. Rourke Ranching, no trespassing. The sign stood a foot over the line, but its message might as well have been nailed to her front door. May stared at it, jaw tightening. She lifted the shotgun and with a single, practiced motion, blew the sign clean off the post. The sound cracked across the empty fields, scattering a few startled birds and echoing briefly off the distant low hills. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Hank Dwyer came rolling up her drive in a cloud of dust. His cruiser was new, government blue with a light bar that flashed lazily, as if it, too, found all this a bit beneath its dignity. Dwyer climbed out, thumbs hooked in his belt, his belly pressing against a tan uniform that stretched too tight across his middle. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned at the temples, but his eyes were sharp, small, and calculating. "Afternoon, Miss Harper," he drawled, shutting the cruiser door with a hip. "Got ourselves a situation needs talking about." May stood on the porch, wiping her hands on a towel that had once been white. "If it's about that sign, I handled it," she said. "It was on my property." Dwyer smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "See, that's where it gets tricky. County records show that corner ain't exactly yours anymore. Lines shift, taxes get late. You know how it is. Mr. Rourke's folks did us the favor of cleaning up some paperwork down at the courthouse. Real civic-minded folks, them Rourkes." "I know where my property line is," May replied. "My husband said it with his father. Your records are wrong." Dwyer's smile thinned. "County records are the law, Miss Harper. And the law says you just discharged a firearm at private property belonging to a respected local businessman. Now, I ain't the type to make a fuss over an old misunderstanding, but Mr. Rourke is mighty particular about folks respecting his boundaries." He stepped onto the bottom porch stair, uninvited, his boot scraping wood. May smelled his aftershave, sharp and artificial, cutting through the honest sense of dust and coffee and cattle. "He made you his errand boy now?" she asked quietly. "That what that badge means these days?" The flash of anger in Dwyer's eyes was quick but real. For a second, she saw the younger man he'd once been, before the Rourke money poured into town, before the campaign donations, before the new cruiser and the remodeled station. "I'm trying to keep you out of trouble," he said, voice lowering. "You sign his papers, you go to town, let his boys take over this place. You move into one of them nice condos they're building by the highway. We don't have a problem. You stay out here, digging in your heels over some dirt you can't even work proper anymore." He shrugged. "Then it gets messy, and I hate messy." May held his gaze until the silence between them turned heavy. A wind gust rattled the chimes by the door, making a thin music that somehow made everything sharper. "I buried my husband on that hill," she said finally. "I raised my boy in that house. Every splinter of this porch has more of my life in it than Clayton Rourke will ever understand. So if he wants it, he can come look me in the eye and ask himself. I won't be bullied out by lawyers and lines on paper, and I won't sign anything because his pet sheriff came and scared me." Dwyer's jaw worked. "You're making a mistake." She nodded once. "Might be, but it's my mistake to make." For a moment, something like respect flickered in his gaze. Then it was gone, replaced by a flat coldness. "Last chance, Miss Harper," he said, stepping back. "Men like Rourke, they don't hear no real well. When you push back, they push harder. I can't always protect folks from what comes next." "Funny," she said. "I thought that was your job." He turned, walked back to the cruiser, and drove away without another word. The next weeks unfolded like an old rope slowly fraying. A truck would idle at the end of her driveway at odd hours, its windows black. Strangers leaned on counters in the diner when she came in for feed and fell abruptly silent, watching her in the mirror. A notice appeared in her mail about delinquent taxes she knew she'd paid. When she checked with the county office, the clerk avoided her eyes and said there'd been processing errors and unexpected adjustments. One night, she woke to the distant lowing of cattle in distress. She grabbed a flashlight and the shotgun and stepped into the cold air, heart thumping with that old rancher's instinct that knew when something was wrong. At the south pasture, the beam of her light swept over shapes on the ground. 2 yearlings, throats slit clean, their bodies left just inside her fence line. There was no need for messages or spray-painted threats. This was language she understood all too well. They were saying, "We can reach anything you love." She called the sheriff's department. The deputy who came out was young, nervous, and clearly unhappy to be there. He took a few pictures, promised a report, then left quickly, like a man who knew standing on Harper land after dark might have a cost. The following afternoon, May drove into town to see the preacher. She didn't need a sermon, just another human voice that wasn't afraid to stand within 10 feet of her. As she parked, she caught her reflection in the storefront window of the hardware store. Small, wiry, gray hair, pinned back, eyes that had watched storms roll in and roll away. On the bulletin board outside the diner, a fresh flyer had been stapled over the church potluck announcement. A sleek advertisement for Rourke Ranching's new desert vista development. Artist renderings showed neat cul-de-sacs and green lawns where scrub and rock currently sat. In the lower corner, a shaded shape looked suspiciously like her hill. May stared, dizziness washing through her. Her land, her husband's grave, reduced to a line item in a glossy brochure. Behind her, laughter rose from inside the diner, loud and forced. She turned and saw Clayton Rourke himself at the counter, flanked by 2 of his foremen, boots up on empty stools. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his thick white hair swept back from a tanned, lined face. His shirt was crisp, his boots too clean for a man who claimed to work cattle. Their eyes met through the glass. His smile was lazy and confident, the smile of a man who owned most of what he could see and rented the rest. He raised his coffee cup in a mocking little toast. May held his gaze, then turned away. She'd come to town for comfort. Instead, she found herself suddenly sure of something. There would be no more letters, no more hints. The next move would be loud, public, and designed to break her. The storm hit 2 days later, under a brutal sun, in broad daylight, where everyone could see exactly what happened and exactly how little anyone would do to stop it. On the other side of the country, in a city where the air smelled of salt and jet fuel, Luke Harper watched the grainy video on his phone with his jaw clenched so tight, his teeth hurt. Someone, he didn't know who yet, had filmed it in shaky vertical, their breathing ragged over the town sounds in the background. The clip opened on the Harper Ranch gate, the old wooden sign swinging uselessly from one hinge. 2 black pickups idled in the road, engines roaring, while 3 men in ball caps and sunglasses hauled May out onto the dirt. She fought like a cat, arms flailing, small frame twisting as they shoved her to her knees. "Just sign, old lady," one of them laughed. "You ain't taking this to your grave." Luke heard his mother's voice, thin but unbroken. "You boys best hope I don't live long enough to see your mamas, 'cause I'd tell 'em how you turned out." They laughed again, colder this time. One man grabbed her by the shoulders and slammed her forward into the dust. Another unfurled a rope, casual as if he were at a branding. The video ended abruptly there, cut off by the curse of someone nearby. The thumbnail of the paused frame, his mother pinned to the ground, hand scraping for leverage, burned into Luke's vision like an afterimage. Above it, the message from an unknown number. "You don't know me. I worked for your dad once. They're gonna kill her, son. Do something." Luke stood in the small rented room he was calling home these days. The walls bare, except for a duffel in the corner and a set of neatly hung fatigues. The bed was made tight enough to bounce a coin off. Titan lay on the floor beside it, head resting on his paws, amber eyes flicking between Luke and the phone. In the dog's posture, there was no softness, no wagging tail or eager whine. He was still waiting, the way he had waited in a dozen dusty compounds while Luke listened to chatter in a language Titan didn't know, reading the tension in his handler's body instead. The black shepherd's chest rose and fell slowly, every breath measured. Luke's hand trembled as he replayed the video, needing every detail, every angle. He noticed the dent in the gatepost John had never gotten around to fixing, the tilt of May's hat, the way the men moved with the swagger of those who believed the sheriff's hand rested warm on their shoulders. In the background, just for a second, he saw the flash of a white Stetson by a truck further up the road. Rourke. "Pack it up," Luke said, his voice low. Titan's ears flicked forward. Luke crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling a worn duffel from under the bed and unzipping it. Inside lay the stripped-down remains of a life he'd tried to leave behind. A pair of desert boots, folded cargo pants, thermal layers. A small locked case he hesitated over only a moment before tossing in. He had left the teams 2 years earlier, carrying a medical discharge, a scar across his thigh, and a sense that whatever he was built for, it wasn't peacetime. He'd bounced between contract jobs, security gigs, sleep he never quite trusted. Through it all, Titan had been the constant. A 4-legged weapon the Navy no longer needed, reclassified and tagged for euthanasia until Luke signed the adoption papers and walked him out of that kennel. They were both, Luke sometimes thought, tools someone had decided were worn out. The world didn't know what to do with them once the war stopped needing them. But watching his mother fight for breath in that dirt, watching those men move on her like vultures, something inside Luke that had been coiled and waiting since he left a dry creek snapped taut. He booked a one-way ticket within the hour. On the plane, Titan lay at his feet, the special harness and paperwork, letting him pass as a service dog. Heads turned, as they always did, at the sight of the massive animal, but no one reached out to pet him. There was something in Titan's eyes that warned off casual hands, a calm, assessing intelligence that made people suddenly fascinated with their seatbelts. Luke stared out the window as clouds drifted past, the landscape below shifting from urban sprawl to patchwork farms to the familiar, unforgiving beige of the desert. Memories surfaced uninvited, riding in the back of his father's truck, dust in his teeth, arguing with John on the porch the night before he left. "You running from something or to something?" his father had demanded. "From here," Luke had shot back. "Ain't that enough?" He'd regretted the words before the taillights disappeared down the road that took him to boot camp, but he had never come back to unsay them. Not for John's funeral, not for the bad years, not for the quiet ones. Now, as the desert rose to meet him again, regret sat in his chest like a stone. The rental truck he picked up at the tiny airport rattled like it might shed parts on the highway, but it drove. Titan sat upright in the back seat, head just below the window line, tracking every mile with predator patience. As Luke turned onto the familiar 2-lane road that led toward Dry Creek, he felt the old ghosts crowding close, the smell of mesquite, the vast dome of sky, the way the air tasted drier here, like it could cut your throat if you weren't respectful. They passed the new Rourke feedlot on the outskirts of town, massive and gleaming, its fences tall and topped with cameras that followed his truck with dead, glassy eyes. A white sign proclaimed Rourke Ranching, building Dry Creek's future. Beneath it, smaller letters promised jobs, growth, opportunity. "What did you build it with?" Luke muttered. "Blood or water?" In town, not much had changed, and everything had. The diner sign still squeaked, but the adjacent lot now hosted a sleek metal building with mirrored windows. Rourke Ranching Regional Headquarters. A new bank stood where the old feed store had been, its logo discreetly sharing a color scheme with Rourke's. Luke parked in front of the diner. Titan moved with him, gliding at his heel, perfectly in step. Heads turned as they walked in, conversations faltering. Some eyes narrowed, trying to place the grown man in front of them. Others flicked to the dog and away again, unsettled. "Coffee," Luke told the waitress, sliding into a booth with his back to the wall. Titan lay under the table, invisible to all but the most observant. His gaze swept the room, pausing on exits, on the man at the counter with the Rourke logo on his jacket, on the deputy in the corner booth sipping sweet tea. The waitress poured his cup, then squinted at him. "Harper?" she asked. "You John's boy." Luke nodded once, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Your mama's stubborn," she said quietly. "Stubborn and alone. You picked a bad time to remember where home is." "Where is she?" he asked. "Out at the ranch, far as I know," the waitress said. "Sheriff's been sniffing around. Rourke, too. Folks say they're fixin' to make an example." The deputy in the corner shifted, his chair scraping. Luke didn't look directly at him, but he saw the man's hand tighten around his glass. As Luke rose to leave, the deputy cleared his throat. "Harper," he called. "You back for a visit, or you looking to stir up what's settled?" "I'm back for my mother," Luke said. "Whatever else I stir up is just gravity." Outside, as he walked to the truck, a black pickup rolled slowly past. 3 men inside, windows down. The driver smirked, eyes sliding over Titan with idle curiosity. "That your dog?" he called. Luke met his gaze. "No," he said. "That's my partner." Titan's lip twitched, just enough for the man to see the flash of white teeth. The pickup accelerated, gravel spitting behind it. Out at the ranch, the gate hung open, one hinge torn free. Luke's chest tightened as he turned up the drive, scanning for movement. The house sat in the same tired slump, but there was a new bruise on its face. A broken front window, glass glittering in the porch light. "Clear," Luke murmured. Titan leaped from the truck, landing soundlessly, then slipped ahead, hugging the side of the house, nose working the air. He moved like water, flowing from shadow to shadow, pausing only to glance back at Luke, checking position. At the front door, Luke found the lock splintered. His hand itched for the weapon he'd locked away for 2 years. He pushed the door gently. It swung inward with a groan. "Mom," he called. Silence. Then a faint clatter from the kitchen. Titan froze, body stiffening, then shot forward at Luke's signal, rounding the corner in a blur. "Don't shoot," a voice yelped. "Don't shoot, it's just me." Luke pivoted into the kitchen to find May, standing there, clutching a frying pan like a shield, cheeks flushed. Titan had stopped exactly 3 feet from her, muscles taut, eyes locked on the pan, waiting for Luke's next command. "Luke," she breathed, pan lowering. For a moment, time slid backward. He saw her as she'd been on the day he left, standing on the same worn linoleum, dish towel in hand, hurt and pride warring in her eyes. Now there were more lines at their corners, more gray in her hair, but the spine was the same. "Hey, Mom," he said softly. She stared at him, then at Titan, then at the broken door. "Well," she said, voice trembling just a little. You sure as hell know how to make an entrance. That first night, they didn't talk about Rourke, or the sheriff, or the video that had dragged Luke home. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee that had grown cold and stories that had grown moss from sitting too long unsaid. May stared at Titan more than once, her gaze cautious, measuring the massive dog with the wariness of someone who understood working animals and the damage they could do if mishandled. What's his name? She asked at last. Titan, Luke replied. Retired Navy, like me. You expect him to chew with his mouth closed too? She muttered, but there was a trace of humor there. Titan, for his part, lay in the doorway between kitchen and hall, perfectly still, his body forming a living barrier. Every few minutes he'd lift his head, ears flicking as if checking the perimeter, then settle again. In the quiet hours before dawn, when May finally drifted off in her chair, Luke slipped out onto the porch with his phone and the locked case from his duffel. He opened it, revealing a compact pistol, legal but well-loved, and a slim drive containing copies of files he'd never quite managed to delete. After-action reports, deployment logs, contact lists. The things he kept not because he needed them, but because they reminded him of a time when he understood what side he was on. He plugged the drive into his phone, accessing secure apps he'd once used overseas. The tools were old, but the skills at his fingertips were muscle memory. He started with county records. The public-facing portal showed exactly what Dwyer had said. Overdue taxes, liens, pending foreclosure proceedings, neatly timed to make May's refusal look like stubborn self-destruction. But records left shadows. He followed them. Shell companies tied back to Rourke ranching branched through real estate holdings in 3 states. Several had quiet incoming wire transfers from accounts flagged in federal databases for unusual international activity. The names on those accounts were Spanish. The banks nestled in border towns where cash moved faster than questions. Cartel money, cleaned through cattle, land, and promises of development. Luke leaned back, jaw tight. He wasn't a cop. He'd spent years in places where the line between soldiering and policing blurred into dust. But he knew dirty money when he saw it. He also knew what men backed by that money thought they could get away with in a forgotten county like this. In the morning, he woke May with a fresh pot of coffee, and the records spread across the table in printed form. You're not just in his way, Luke said. You're on top of something he needs. This isn't about the view. It's about the water. May traced a line on the map with her finger, following the contour of the underground aquifer the state had surveyed decades ago. It cut directly beneath the Harper Ranch, then under the hills Rourke already owned, before disappearing toward a stretch of desert that looked, on paper, like worthless scrub. What's out there? Luke asked. Nothing, May said automatically. Then she hesitated. At least, wasn't. Not till a year ago. Then we started seeing more trucks, more lights on the horizon at night. Folks said Rourke was building new pens, maybe a feedlot. But no one close I know works there. They bring in their own men. Luke circled that area on the map. You ever ask why a feedlot would need armed guards and a high fence? She gave him a sharp look. You seen it? On the drive in, he said. Fancy security for cows. May's eyes hardened. They ain't just moving cattle. The next days fell into a tense rhythm. In the mornings, Luke walked the fence lines with May, repairing cuts, replacing posts. Titan ranged ahead, sweeping the land with his nose, pausing at every unfamiliar scent. Twice he alerted, body stiff, ears angled toward distant engine noise, a truck lingering just out of sight beyond a rise. Luke marked the positions in his mind, plotting them on a mental grid. In town, whispers grew louder. A clerk at the feed store warned May that the bank was reviewing her case. The pastor stopped Luke after church, eyes anxious. "Son, there are forces moving through here that don't care about God or law," he said. "You poke in a hornet's nest." "Then it's about time someone smoked it out," Luke replied. He found allies in unlikely places. The mailman handed him an unlisted number scribbled on the back of a receipt. "State investigator," he murmured. "Been sniffing around Rourke for a while. Feds too, I hear, but they're slow as sap. Maybe you can light a fire under someone." That night, Luke made a call. The woman who answered had a voice like sandpaper and patience. She listened as he laid out the shell companies, the wire transfers, the pattern of land grabs. "You got proof?" she asked. "I got enough to make you curious," he said. "And I got a mother they're going to break in half to close their pipeline." There was a pause, papers rustling on the other end. "Name's Ruiz," she said. "State Attorney's Office. You send me what you got. In the meantime, don't do anything that gets you or your mother killed before I can get boots on the ground." Luke hung up and stared at the dark outside the kitchen window. Titan sat by the door, gaze fixed on the night. "They're not waiting," Luke said quietly. "Why should we?" The answer came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, a county notice arrived by certified mail. May signed for it with a hand that didn't shake, then opened it at the table. Luke watched her face harden as she read. "What is it?" he asked. "Eviction order," she said. "Signed by a judge I went to school with. Says we've got 30 days to vacate due to safety violations and unpaid assessments. 30 days, Luke." He scanned the document. The violations listed were laughable. Loose porch board, outdated electrical, an old barn, no longer compliant with modern livestock safety standards. But stamped at the bottom, in heavy ink, was the seal of the county and the signature of the sheriff's office verifying the inspection. "Hank," May whispered. Betrayal cutting deeper than any threat. Luke's phone buzzed, a message from the unknown number that had first sent him the video. "They're moving today, not 30 days. They're coming now." He grabbed his gear. "They're using the order as cover," he said. "They scare you into leaving today, haul your stuff out, accidentally, misplace some paperwork, and by the time anyone from the state gets here, your land's already signed over." May squared her shoulders. "Then we don't leave." The rumble of engines reached them before the dust. Titan rose, moving to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. His body language shifted, muscles coiling, tail stiff, ears pointed like arrows. Luke took one look at him and knew. "Multiple vehicles," he said, armed. The convoy pulled into the yard, 2 black pickups, a county truck, and last, the sheriff's cruiser. Clayton Rourke stepped out first, immaculate as always, white hat throwing his face into shadow. Dwyer emerged from the cruiser, hat tilted, thumbs already hooked in his belt. Behind them, 6 men in vests spread out, hands resting on rifles with an ease that said they'd held them often. "Miss Harper," Rourke called, his voice warm and carrying. "We're here to help you with your transition. Got some boys'll move your things for you. No charge. We'll get you set up right nice in town." May opened the door and stepped onto the porch before Luke could stop her. Titan flowed beside him, a living shadow at his heel. "I'm not leaving," she said, loud enough for every neighbor watching from a safe distance on the road to hear. "This is my home." Rourke's smile thinned. "Now, I respect your attachment," he said. "Truly, I do. But the county's deemed this property unsafe. Sheriff here's gotta enforce the order. That's just how civilized folks do things." Dwyer shifted, eyes flicking to Luke and Titan. For a second, something like doubt trembled in his posture. Then he saw the watching faces by the road, the phones held low, but recording, and his jaw hardened. "Luke," he said, voice leveling out into official cadence, "I'm going to ask you and your mother to step aside and let us do our job. Don't make this harder than it has to be. If your job was protecting people instead of escorting paid thugs onto their land, you wouldn't be standing there, Luke replied. The men in vests bristled, fingers tightening on their weapons. Titan's gaze locked on the nearest threat, body vibrating with controlled readiness. Rourke sighed dramatically. I tried to be gentle, he said. Boys, move her. The nearest man stepped onto the porch, reaching for May's arm. Before his hand could close, Titan was there, teeth bared, a low, rumbling growl, leaving no doubt what would happen if that hand moved another inch. Call him off, Dwyer snapped, hand dropping to his gun. Luke held up his hands, palms out. Titan, stay, he ordered. The dog froze, growl cutting off mid-vibration, but his eyes never left the man's throat. This is your last warning, Dwyer said. No, May said calmly. This is yours. The standoff lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, the lines that had once been blurred in Dry Creek snapped into brutal clarity. Rourke's money, Dwyer's badge, one widow and her son, a dog that had seen more war than any of them. Then the men surged forward, and the quiet war for Dry Creek turned loud. The first shove sent May stumbling back against the porch rail, breath knocked from her chest. Luke moved instinctively, placing himself between her and the closest enforcer. A hand grabbed his shoulder from behind, trying to wrench him around, but years of training flowed through him like a reflexive tide. He dipped his weight, seized the man's wrist, and used his momentum to send him tumbling down the steps, crashing into a second thug on the dirt below. Titan, guard, Luke barked. The command snapped through the air like a shot. Titan leaped forward, placing his bulk firmly in front of May, body turned sideways to shield her while still giving him forward momentum. His lips peeled back, exposing teeth honed by evolution and training. But he did not lunge. Not yet. Not without the next word. Rourke's men hesitated. It was one thing to rough up an old woman. It was another to advance on a military-bred shepherd whose muscles trembled with contained violence. Sheriff, Rourke said sharply, control this situation. Dwyer's face was pale, sweat beading at his hairline. He drew his weapon, the action jerky. For a heartbeat, his eyes met May's. Something unreadable passed between them. Then he looked away, focusing instead on Luke. Hands where I can see 'em, Harper, he shouted. You're interfering with a lawful eviction. Don't make me put you down in front of your mama. Luke lifted his hands slowly, palms out, though his mind was already charting distances, angles, the positions of every rifle. You pull that trigger, he said, voice steady. And I guarantee I won't be the only one bleeding on this dirt. The watching neighbors shifted uneasily. Phones rose higher now, openly recording. Rourke's jaw tightened. Publicity wasn't what he wanted today. He needed clean lines, simple narratives, a crazy old widow, a hot-headed son, a sheriff forced to act. He gestured subtly to one of his men, a thick-set brute with a scar down his jaw. The man nodded, circling toward the truck parked closest to the porch, hands sliding into the bed. Luke's eyes followed the movement, his gut clenched as he saw the coil of rope and the open cargo space. They weren't just here to push her out, they were here to stage something. An accident. A scene others could describe in carefully chosen words later. Mom, he whispered, not looking back. Go inside. I'm not leaving you, she whispered back. Titan's head turned slightly, catching Luke's tone. The dog lowered his center of gravity, ready. Everything that followed happened in a blur. The kind of blur Luke's mind would replay in frame-by-frame clarity for the rest of his life. Scarjaw lunged onto the porch, swinging the rope. Dwyer shouted something lost in the sudden cacophony. Rourke stepped back, lips curling in distaste at the messiness of it all. One of the enforcers flanked left, trying to get a clear angle past Titan. Now! Rourke barked. The thug hurled himself at May, catching her by the arm, yanking her forward so hard, she cried out. Titan exploded, the wordless thunder of unleashed purpose. He hit the man-center mass with a force that seemed to bend reality for a moment, sending him flying backwards off the porch steps. The rope slipped from his hands, falling uselessly at May's feet. Titan landed over the fallen man, teeth clamped around the padded vest at his chest. Not flesh. Precision over fury. He drove the man's shoulders into the dirt, pinning him like a nailed board. The thug's weapon skittered away. Titan did not tear. He did not thrash. He held, immovable, growl vibrating through his captive's bones. "Control your damn animal," Dwyer shouted, gun swinging toward the dog. The neighbors gasped, phones jostled, catching the glint of the sheriff's barrel. Luke moved. He stepped between the muzzle and Titan, hands still up. "You shoot my dog in front of half the town," he said, voice carrying. "And every one of those videos goes straight to the state, the feds, and every news station that still remembers Dry Creek. You ready for that, Hank?" Dwyer's finger twitched on the trigger. He was sweating harder now, caught between loyalty to Rourke and the instinct that told him this was spiraling beyond his control. Rourke, seeing his carefully staged intimidation turn into a potential media nightmare, snapped, "That's enough. We'll regroup. This ain't the only way to break a stubborn mule." He turned to leave. That was when the shot cracked the air, not from Dwyer's gun, but from the road. The bullet smacked into a fence post an inch from Rourke's shoulder, splintering wood. Every head snapped toward the source. On the ridgeline beyond the road, a figure stood framed against the sky, one of Rourke's own lookouts, rifle in hand, face twisted in surprise. Luke felt his stomach drop. There was no reason for one of Rourke's men to fire. Not there, not now, unless someone else had ordered it. Or someone else was sending a message. The next seconds devolved into chaos. The lookout shouted something unintelligible. One of the enforcers, nerves shredded, fired a panicked round into the dirt near the porch. The ricochet sang past May's ear. Titan's growl rose in pitch. Neighbors shrieked and ducked behind cars. And May, pushed too far, did something no one expected. She stepped off the porch, past Luke, past the sheriff's wavering gun, and faced Rourke squarely in the yard. "You think I'm scared of you?" she shouted over the ringing in everyone's ears. "You think I'll crawl into some little box you built because you brought your toys and your coward's money to my gate? This land knows me. It don't know you. And one day soon, this county's gonna remember which of us belongs here." A hush fell, not of silence, but of held breath. Rourke's face darkened, the charming mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "Put her in the truck," he hissed. "We'll finish this where cameras don't matter." The men surged again, this time with real fear driving them. Luke caught a fist to the jaw, taste of copper blooming against his teeth. He swung back, elbow connecting with someone's ribs. Titan released his pinned target at Luke's sharp command and pivoted, intercepting another thug rushing for May. He launched upward, jaws closing on the man's forearm, not tearing, but crushing, holding, stopping the arm from dragging May's shoulders out of their sockets. The man screamed, knees buckling. Two enforcers grabbed May around the waist, lifting her off her feet. She kicked, heels slamming into shins, fingers clawing for purchase in the air. The rope snaked around her ankles, pulled tight in a practiced jerk. "Luke!" she cried. He lunged for her, but a rifle butt smashed into his ribs, dropping him to one knee. The world pulsed white around the edges. Through the pain, he saw Dwyer standing frozen, gun half raised, eyes wide and lost. "Hank," Luke gasped, "don't you let them take her." For a split second, the sheriff's facade cracked. He looked at May, bound and struggling, then at Rourke, whose gaze burned with a warning years in the making. The weight of every favor, every dollar, every compromise pulled his shoulders down. He holstered his gun. "Load her up," he said, voice flat. They dragged May toward the waiting truck, rope scraping her ankles raw as they tied it off to the hitch. Dust billowed around her like smoke. Neighbors turned away, some weeping, some already rationalizing the scene in their minds. Titan fought to get to her, entire body straining against Luke's grip on his collar. It took everything Luke had to hold the dog back. Titan had the strength to break a man in half when unleashed, but also the discipline to trust his handler's restraint. "You'll get yourself shot," Luke hissed into Titan's fur. "Not yet. Not like this." The truck engine roared. The line went taut. May hit the dirt with a grunt, then a cry as the vehicle began to move. Her hands clawed for purchase, fingers digging trenches. Luke's vision tunneled. The world slowed, each heartbeat a gunshot. He could calculate the odds, the angles, the number of guns against them. He could retreat, regroup, call Ruiz, wait for the law to grind slowly toward justice. Or he could do what he had been trained his whole life to do when someone under his protection was dragged into the dirt. He released Titan's collar. "Track," he shouted, pointing at the truck. "Titan, track and stop." The dog exploded from a coil of compressed power into a streak of black fury. He tore across the yard, muscles bunching, paws eating the distance. Dust rose behind him in a comet's tail. He hit the truck in 3 strides, launching onto the tailgate, claws scraping metal, teeth latching onto the rope in a blur. With a savage wrench of his neck, he tore it free from the hitch, the fibers snapping under the force. The sudden slack sent May tumbling to a stop, rolling onto her side. The truck lurched forward, free of its human burden, but now dragging a furious dog half into its bed. The driver panicked, swerving. Titan lost his grip on the rope, but not his purpose. He leaped up, forepaws hooking over the side, jaws snapping just shy of the driver's exposed arm in the open window. The man screamed, slammed on the brakes, then threw the truck into reverse. Titan dropped, rolled, vanished in a cloud of dust. "Titan!" Luke shouted, heart stopping. The truck shot backward directly toward May, who was struggling to rise. Luke sprinted, lungs burning, but he knew he wouldn't make it in time. Then, out of the swirling dust, Titan appeared, planting himself between the truck and May, body low, eyes blazing. He barked once, short, thunderous. The sound cut through the driver's panic like a blade. In that split second of hesitation, Luke reached the cab, throwing himself against the door, dragging the driver out and onto the ground. They grappled in the dirt, fists and knees and curses. Titan circled, snapping at any hand that reached for a weapon, his presence turning the brawl into something more like a controlled demolition than a chaotic fight. Rourke shouted for his men to fall back, retreat to the trucks. The plan had shattered. There were too many witnesses, too much blood already spilled in the wrong pattern. "We'll finish it at the compound," he barked. "Move!" One pickup roared to life, men scrambling into the bed, weapons swinging. Titan sprinted after it as it tore down the drive, nose to the dust, locking onto the scent of sweat, oil, and cheap cologne. He didn't need Luke's command this time. Tracking was in his bones. "Let him go," Luke rasped, helping May to her feet. "He'll mark their trail. We'll find them." May clutched his arm, legs shaking. "They'll regroup out there," she whispered. "No cameras, no neighbors, just their guns and your dog." "And me," Luke said. "They'll have me." Dwyer stumbled forward, face ashen. "Rourke's done," Luke said to him, voice harsh. "You just don't know it yet. I've got records headed to the state and the feds. They see this. They see the payments, the shell companies. He's finished. You can come in on the right side of this or go down holding his hat." The sheriff swayed, the weight of years on his shoulders. For once, his gaze didn't slide away. It met Luke's dead on. "Where are they going?" Luke pressed. Dwyer closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Old Morales place," he muttered. "Other side of the canyon. Looks like a feedlot on paper." Ain't. They got storage there, and a hole in the fence on the border no one's supposed to know about. Luke nodded. He squeezed May's hand once, fierce. I'll bring this back, he said quietly. You, this land, him. She stared at him like she was memorizing his face. You bring yourself back first, she said. He kissed her forehead, then turned to the neighbors. Get her inside, he ordered. Lock the doors. Anyone comes here without a badge and a state seal you recognize, you don't open them. Then he grabbed his duffel, slung his rifle, and headed for the truck. Titan's form was already a black speck on the horizon, chasing the dust trail toward the hidden heart of Rourke's operation. The final war for Dry Creek had left the front yard. It was headed for the desert, where men like Luke had always done their worst and finest work. By the time state vehicles appeared on the horizon, their light bars strobing against the afternoon sky, the compound at the old Morales place was already smoking. Not from fire. Luke had been careful about that. But from the dust blown up by retreating trucks, fleeing men, and the wind scrubbing away the last evidence of a night full of reckoning. May watched from her porch as the convoy rolled past in a rush of sirens, heading toward the canyon road. News traveled faster than any cruiser. By dawn, word of the shootout, the seized contraband, the chain of arrests that stretched from the compound to the courthouse had spread through town like wildfire. What the town didn't know yet, what May kept to herself in the tender cage of her ribs, was the moment Titan had led Luke through the final gate. She'd heard it from Luke's lips later, sitting at this same table, his voice low, Titan's head resting on his boot like an anchor. How the dog had followed the fleeing truck's scent through miles of scrub, ignoring his own fatigue, pushing into the night like a black arrow. How he'd halted at the edge of the high fence, nose lifted, catching the heavier stink of men, gasoline, fear. How Luke had hoisted Titan through a cut in the wire, then slid through beside him, moving silent between stacked pallets that weren't holding feed, but bricks of shrink-wrapped powder. How Titan had frozen, ears snapping toward the sound of a guard pivoting in the dark. At Luke's hissed, "Take," Titan had launched like a shadow, closing his jaws around the man's gun arm, twisting, dropping him without a scream. Luke's phone had been streaming audio live to investigator Ruiz's office the whole time, his body cam feeding shaky visuals of documents, faces, the open ledger on Rourke's desk. When Rourke himself had stepped from the office trailer, pistol in hand, Titan had positioned himself between the muzzle and Luke's chest, growl low, ready to have his body be the first and last thing any bullet met. In the end, it was Dwyer who'd tipped the balance, arriving with the state units he'd quietly called after Luke left. Badge suddenly heavy with a different kind of responsibility. He'd walked into the compound with his hands raised, telling Rourke the world had changed while he'd been out in the desert, thinking Dry Creek was still his alone. Rourke had reached for his gun. Titan had been faster. He barreled into the man's legs, sending him sprawling, the pistol skittering out of reach. Luke's boot had pinned it a heartbeat later. Now, days after the dust settled, papers were being signed in neat offices miles away. Asset forfeiture, federal charges, headlines about cartel pipelines disrupted by joint operation in small border county. They mentioned state investigators, federal task forces, local cooperation. They did not mention the 72-year-old widow who refused to sell, or the retired war dog whose teeth had written the punctuation on Rourke's last stand. In Dry Creek, however, stories grew in their own soil. At the diner, someone had taped a photo to the bulletin board. May standing in front of her mended gate, Luke at one shoulder, Titan at the other. The caption, scrawled in marker, read, "Some lines you don't cross." Dwyer came to the ranch a week after the raid, hat in his hand, badge clipped to his belt like it might fall off if he didn't hold himself just so. He stood at the bottom of the steps, not climbing until May nodded once. "I turned in my resignation yesterday," he said. "State'll do what they do. Might see a courtroom, might not. But I wanted to tell you myself, I was wrong, all the way down the line." May studied him, seeing not the man who'd stood in her yard with Rourke, but the boy who'd once shyly asked John for advice on joining the force. Life layered on a man like dust, she thought. Some of it he chose. Some of it just settled while he wasn't looking. "You got a chance to do the right thing, and you took it," she said. "Just came a little late for my taste." He nodded, swallowing. "If you ever need anything." "I'll call the new sheriff," she said. But there wasn't heat in it. He accepted the rebuke like penance and left. That evening, Luke walked the hill to his father's grave, Titan padding at his side. May joined them halfway up, her hand slipping into Luke's arm with a familiarity that made his throat tight. "They offered me a deal," Luke said, staring at the stone. "Consultant for the state, help track other outfits like Rourke's. Move around, follow the money, the trucks." May's hand tightened on his arm. "And?" He looked out over the land, the windmill turning, the cattle moving slow, the porch light of the house glowing warm against the encroaching dark. Titan sat between them and the world, eyes always roving. But there was a looseness in his shoulders, now Luke hadn't seen in years. "I told him I'd help," he said. "From here. They send cases, I send answers. Maybe sometimes I go. But this," he gestured at the ranch, the grave, the woman at his side. "This is home base now." May exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry decades with it. "Your daddy would have liked that," she said softly. "He was stubborn, but he wasn't blind. He wanted you to fight for something that mattered. Took the long way round, but you got here." They stood in silence as the sky bled from orange to deep indigo. Titan lay at their feet, finally closing his eyes, as if the long watch he'd kept since war had briefly, mercifully, eased. Down in town, lights flicked on one by one. Life went on. Babies cried. Dishes clattered. A radio played a cracked country song. Dry Creek was still small, still rough around the edges. But the chokehold of fear had loosened. People walked a little taller. They'd seen what happened when one woman refused to be moved, when her son came home with a dog that did not understand surrender. As stars pricked through the dark, May slipped her arm around Luke's waist. "You know," she said, voice warm with quiet pride. "For a boy who swore he'd never come back, you're doing a fine job of sticking around." Luke laughed, the sound rusty but real. Titan's tail thumped once, a single heavy beat against the earth. "Yeah," Luke said, looking out over the land they'd fought for. "Turns out some places are worth fighting for twice." In a world that moves at the speed of headlines and hashtags, it's easy to think real battles only happen on distant front lines or in marble courthouses shown on the news. But courage rarely starts under bright lights. More often, it begins on a dusty porch no one is watching, with one person whispering no to a power that expects them to fold. May Harper didn't have money, or lawyers, or a private security team. What she had was a lifetime tied to a strip of stubborn land, and a refusal to sell her soul for someone else's convenience. Luke brought back the skills he'd learned in Foreign Shadows, and Titan carried the discipline and ferocity of 1,000 drills. Together, they reminded a town that law means nothing without conscience, that a badge bought is just metal, and that the weak are only truly helpless when the strong decide to look away. Not everyone can fight cartels or strip a weapon in the dark, but everyone can choose what lines they will not cross, what pieces of their life are not for sale. Courage isn't the absence of fear, It's standing your ground while your knees shake and your voice cracks, trusting that the truth you're guarding is worth the cost. Because sometimes all it takes to break a corrupt empire is one widow in the dirt, one son who comes home, and one four-legged warrior who refuses to let the rope stay tied.